Here I want to talk a little bit about the background to the Apostle Paul. Now, Paul is attributed with writing 13 of the 27 books that we find in the New Testament. And so when you think about it, just adding up all the passages in the New Testament part of the Bible attributed to Paul, he has a phenomenal influence, and his voice is a loud one in early Christianity. No other author or Christian leader is as attributed with as much influence as Paul does, at least in terms of the New Testament. Now, of those 13 books attributed to Paul, you probably learned in your Luke Acts course that some of those are disputed in that some scholars believe that Paul did not write them, but that someone wrote them under Paul's name. And among the disputed letters would include letters like 2 Thessalonians, Ephesians, Colossians, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus, that some scholars believe that these were not penned by the Apostle Paul. I happen to think that a good case can be made for him penning them, perhaps through a different secretary that he dictated them through, or using a different style, but it is an open question. And then there are the undisputed letters. And among those undisputed letters that nearly all scholars acknowledge as coming from the Apostle Paul are Galatians and Romans, which would be the subject of this course, 1 Thessalonians, Philippians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and Philemon. So you add all that up, and you have some disputed, some undisputed, that end up with 13 letters. Now, although Paul likely lived during Jesus' lifetime, it is unlikely that they ever met personally. But here's what we do know about Paul. Paul was born in Tarsus, which was a university city in the province of Cilicia in the Roman Empire. Although you probably haven't heard of Tarsus before, it was a center for Greek learning. And there it's very likely that Paul was schooled in Greek philosophy and rhetoric. It is unsurprising that when we read Paul's speeches in the book of Acts, in Acts 17, his speech in Athens, that Paul quotes philosophers and poets such as Epimenides and Aratus, seemingly from memory. It's very likely that Paul was steeped in Greco-Roman and particularly Greek philosophy. He also quotes a philosopher named Menander in 1 Corinthians, and so he was well educated from a Greek perspective. He was also born a Roman citizen, which is very unusual for anybody. Most people bought their citizenship later in life, and it was very unusual for Jewish people to be Roman citizens. Paul was born into three separate cultures. First and foremost, Paul was a Jew. He was a part of the people of Israel. He describes himself in Philippians chapter 3 as from the tribe of Benjamin and a Pharisee of Pharisee. When leaving the city of Tarsus, Paul ended up in Jerusalem, and there he studied under the very famous Rabbi Gamaliel. Paul embraced a variety of Judaism known as Hellenistic Judaism. Hellenistic Jews were Jewish people who sought to be faithful to their Jewish faith, but at the same time actively engaging Greek culture. And so Hellenistic Jews, like Paul, spoke Greek. They did not avoid contact with non-Jewish people. In many ways, they sought it out and sought how to live faithfully to their covenant as Jewish people, to their covenant with God in the context of the Greek world. They often read Greek, studied philosophy, and so forth. This is in contrast with another variety of Jews called Hellenistic, or called Hebraic Jews. Hebraic Jews were more isolationist in their attitudes towards Greek culture. So Hebraic Jews would only speak Hebrew or Aramaic. They would avoid contact with non-Jewish people, and they lived in their own enclaves, avoiding the influence of the Hellenistic or Greek world as much as possible. As I already mentioned, Paul described him as a Pharisee. The Pharisees were a variety in Judaism that was a renewal movement. They were a lay movement in the sense that none of the Pharisees were ordained clergy or priests within Judaism. All of them were well-respected leaders that had a trade or a business, and the Pharisaical movement focused on calling the people of Israel to take their covenant with God seriously and to live holy lives. And as you well know from your Luke Acts class, Jesus frequently ran into conflict with the Pharisees over their definition of holiness. Well, Paul saw himself within the Pharisaical, Hellenistic, Jewish variety of Judaism of his time. So he was a Jew. But the second culture that he was part of was the Hellenistic or the Greek culture. Greek culture, going back to Alexander the Great and even before that to Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, was highly influential throughout the Greco-Roman world. The cradle of Western philosophy and Western democracy is arguably Greece. Now, Alexander, who was a student of the famous philosopher Aristotle, who himself did not become a philosopher but became a conqueror, believed that Greek culture was superior to all other cultures. He believed that Greeks were truly civilized human beings and all non-Greeks were barbarians and subhuman. And so Alexander, in his conquests, as he sought to conquer the world in the name of Greek philosophy, saw himself as an evangelist, if we could use that word, for Greek philosophy. He sought to not only dominate, but he sought to bring Greek philosophy wherever he went. That was through both conquest and persuasion. Paul was well aware of Greek philosophy, having been schooled in Tarsus. And if the Greeks provided the culture of Paul's world. But if they provided the culture, the Romans provided the political structure. That's why we call the Roman Empire the Greco-Roman world. By this time, Rome was well into the imperial period of its history. It was no longer a republic. The emperor at this time was hailed and adored as God on earth, and there were temples that were dedicated to the Roman emperor throughout the Greco-Roman world. The Romans provided security and structure throughout the Roman Empire, such as roads and bridges and law enforcement and irrigation and running water and these things. But they ruled with brutality and impunity, and they highly taxed those outside of the city of Rome. Paul was a Jewish Pharisee who took an accommodationist view towards Greek culture. And he was also born a Roman citizen. In many ways, Paul was tricultural. He was able to freely move about and function in a Jewish setting, in a Greek setting, and in a Roman setting. And because of this, Paul was a logical choice to be the one who would take the Christian message, which began as an exclusively Jewish message, and to begin to communicate that message and bring it to the non-Jewish world of the Greco-Roman world. As I said, Paul was uniquely qualified to do this. And although it was the Apostle Peter who was actually the first one we read about in the New Testament bringing the Christian message to non-Jewish people, and that would have been in Acts chapter 10, the household of Cornelius that Peter brings the message to, Paul was actually the first to think through theologically and strategically what it meant for non-Jewish people throughout the Greco-Roman world to trust in Jesus, follow Jesus, and become a community that we call the church. Within many of the more conservative wings of the Jewish Christian church, many people thought that Paul's message and his methods were far too radical and dangerous. And we'll learn far more about that when we talk about Paul's opponents at the beginning of our lecture into Galatians. But for now, I want you to think about your own cultural experience. Many of us, like Paul, have learned to function in more than one culture in our lives, whether major cultures like Paul did, the Jewish, the Greek, and the Roman culture, or perhaps in subcultures that you've grown up in. I want you to think about your own capacity to move among more than one culture and then respond to the prompt for this week and what it's like for you to do that.